With me now, MSNBC contributor and now former Republican strategist Steve Schmidt, co-host of the Words Matter podcast, which is a apt title. How did we get here?
Well, however we got here, we're here, and where we are is at an unprecedented place in American history. We have never had a president of the United States do what this president is doing. He is stoking a cold civil war in this country, and it has turned hot on the periphery. This man, Bowers, what he said was, when he went in, he said, "I can't sit by and watch my people get slaughtered. Screw the optics, I'm going in." And he went in to kill Jews. The Jews he believed that were financing the caravan, the invading army, like a Panzer division that is threatening the southern border, an army that is racked and riddled with disease. The same type of rhetoric, the same type of propaganda that you would have seen in Germany in 1938, the dehumanization, turning people into infested vermin. What Trump is doing is stoking and inciting, for the purposes of political power, the worst amongst us to take action in his name. We have a situation where, for the grace of God, the largest mass assassination attempt in American history was avoided that targeted, amongst them, two former presidents of the United States. Every one of those people was a target of Donald Trump's. And this man, a fanatic, was radicalized by Fox News, by talk radio, by a right-wing propaganda machine that is as sophisticated as it has turned deadly.
How do you, we end up in these situations sometimes of, this false equivalency, this sort of, it's hard to get your arms around the asymmetry in American political life at this moment. And I imagine you have lots of people, you spend a career in Republican politics, right? How do you communicate about the abnormality of what has formed on the right at this particular moment? Because people say, well, the left, they've got this and that. And it's true, you can criticize, we criticize Sheldon Adelson. There's all sorts of ways to criticize George Soros. There's all sorts of ways to make your contentions in American politics. It's rough and tumble. There's something distinct going on in the American right. How do you communicate that to people that exist on the American right?
William F. Buckley's great contribution to America and to American conservatism was to kick the crazies out of the conservative movement. Probably a longer discussion than we have time for tonight, but unfortunately, looking back, that the word liberal became an epithet because liberalism, small L liberalism, right? Conservatism is a root branch of it. And the Democratic parties and the Republican parties, both liberal parties, compete in the arena of ideas to move the country forward. What we are seeing is the co-option of the conservative project, the Republican Party, in a cult of personality, which is fundamentally unconservative, led by Donald Trump, that is authoritarian in nature, that is antithetical to the orthodoxies of the Republican Party and the conservative movement as they have existed over the last 40 years. But it is something more. It is the incitement. Imagine, after a bomb was sent to CNN, the President of the United States goes and says, the press, the free press, is the enemies of the people. And then he says, the anger in the country is caused by the press who reports critically of him. What he is saying to the next sick person on the end of the transmission is, if you take an action, it's because they deserve it. What we are seeing, just as we saw young, displaced, evil, or sick, or just plain losers be radicalized by ISIS, we are seeing the same thing in the United States right now. These two losers, these two sick people, these two evil people, three evil people, being radicalized by this right-wing propaganda industry. And that's exactly what it is. This whole caravan in the last week of the election is a giant lie. This is Trump's Reichstag fire.
Yeah.
It is a lie. and that the United States military, the most powerful armed force in the world, would be deployed at a brigade size unit level to the southern border to stop this caravan, which is 1,000 miles away and made up of women and children. The insinuations that it's filled with terrorists and Middle Easterners. 40% of the country has opted into an alternate reality. We have to wake up in this country and understand the danger that this presents to all of us. We can't put our heads in the sand. Kellyanne Conway despicably today goes on national television and she said, well, this shooter's motives were because there's an anti-religious sentiment. No, ma'am. The propaganda industry that she commands with the vile president that she serves, abetted by Mark Levin and Rush Limbaugh and Breitbart and Newsbusters and Judicial Watch and all the rest of them, have blood on their hands for the incitements that they have made that have triggered and radicalized these crazy people. It is deliberate in intent. He scapegoats minority populations. He alleges conspiracies. He creates a sense of shared and virtuous victimhood, positions himself as the avenger, and there is no cost too high so long as it benefits his narcissism, so long as it benefits him politically.
Let me ask you this final question. There's a memory holding that keeps happening. Everything you just said there has been echoed in the past at different moments by Mitt Romney, by Lindsey Graham, by Marco Rubio, by Rick Perry. I mean, on and on and on. Ben Shapiro wrote about this. There was times when the confrontation with Trumpism was new to conservatives where they called it what it was. But surely the Borg assimilates them. And what I find so unnerving is that you watch one after another, no longer able to muster the obvious clarity of that diagnosis.
All of these people were happy to stand and assert that they believed in the American idea and ideal when the American idea and ideal was not being tested, when it was not under assault, when it was not being contested. What we see is a crisis of profound cowardice in what I would argue is the worst generation of political leadership the country may have ever had. We don't see very many Teddy Roosevelt Jr.'s using his privilege to fight to be the first man off the first landing craft on D-Day, to lead the men ashore. We don't see very much of that in American life anymore. The capitulation to this, the cowardice in the face of the evil that we saw this past weekend, the willful blindness and ignorance about the threat that is growing. And the question this week isn't who's going to keep control of Congress or get control of Congress. It's will there be more blood in this country this week heading to an election? And this is what we used to see around the world in banana republics, in emerging democracies, but not here. We don't settle our political disputes and elections with guns and knives. We don't have presidents in this country until now who stoke the American people to be at each other's throats. And after 2 years of this is the deadly consequence. Anti-Semitic attacks in America rose 60% last year. As was pointed out by a writer in the Atlantic magazine, whose name I can't recall in the moment, do we have 60% more anti-Semites?
Right.
Or what has happened? Causally, what has happened? And so when Trump says I'm a nationalist, white supremacists, neo-Nazis, Klansmen celebrate. They are ecstatic. There are people who say that you shouldn't mention the Daily Stormer on a show like this. But you know what? Not mentioning them on a show like this doesn't mean they're not there.
It's true.
They are there, and they are emboldened, and they are excited, and they feel that they have been mainstreamed by this president and his winks and nods and dog whistles and outright near endorsements. And what a signal he sends on a day where we see the largest mass killing of Jews in American history, incited by this propaganda machine where His reasons in his final tweets are the exact talking points that spew forth in this vile, toxic sewage from talk radio, from the dark corners of the internet, from Fox News, from Sinclair Broadcasting. It's exactly the same message. And anybody who sits there and says that there is not causality between these events and the incitements is as dishonest as they are blind.
Steve Schmidt, thank you very much for being here.
My pleasure.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.